Okay, excellent. Welcome everyone to this IES webinar, Climate Finance for Resilience and Adaptation, Mind the Gap. I'm delighted to be joined by Professor David Viner. David is an internationally recognized climate change, ESG, and transition strategist with over 30 years of experience working internationally in the academic, public, and private sectors. Notably, he is coordinating lead author for the IPCC's Working Group 2 report, which was published in February, and he'll be talking a bit about that today. As ever, after David's presentation, you will have the opportunity to ask questions. So please do submit these in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. And you can do this at any point during the presentation, and I will then read these out on your behalf later on. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the IES website and YouTube channel. Thank you very much for logging in. It's great to see so many of you here. And thank you to David, who I'll now hand over to. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you very much for the opportunity of presenting again. If you are in the UK or in this time zone, good afternoon and good day to you wherever else you are, if anyone's joining from overseas. Yeah, I'm just really looking at, in this webinar to bring up the issues around climate finance for resilience and adaptation. So this is around the adaptation piece, and I'll interchange use of the words resilience and adaptation, although normally I'm fairly stringent on the division between the two. It's just the way the language has been brought about within the discussions around the IPCC, and the work I'm going to report on here is related purely to the IPCC and what was covered and what wasn't covered, and probably the more questions than answered that were provided as well. So just as a way of introduction, sorry, let me get a tech in order. Yeah, I'm going to introduce the IPCC Working Group 2 report, which was released a couple of weeks ago now. Unfortunately, it was in the shadow of the start of the tragic conflict in the Ukraine. But prior to that, the previous 2 weeks were the government plenary session, which was interesting because all the world governments were there going through the summary for policymakers line by line, word by word, and that included, the Russians, the Indians, all the major countries, and overall it was a very positive experience. There was some detailed discussion, but there was nothing controversial at all. And it was a very, very positive experience. So it's really sad to see the breakdown in trust amongst the countries at an international level. So in terms of the background to the report, the outline for the report was put in place about 4 or 5 years ago. There's a meeting of academics and governments where they look at the outline structure, and they're given some framework by the government, and that's put in place. So the report has been in development for about 5 years now. There's 270 coordinating lead authors and lead authors on the report, covering 18 chapters and a number of cross-chapter papers covering specific issues. They were drawn from a pool of 67 countries, and the authors are either nominated by countries or nominated through countries or major UN agencies, and then they're chosen and vetted by the government. So this is again another part of the review process. And over the last few IPCC assessment cycles, they've been trying to improve the distribution and the coverage. So there's increasing number of developing country scientists on board, 43% now. I think when I first joined in the early 90s, it was very limited, maybe only 10, 15%. 41% of women, 59% of men. And we were supported by just short of 700 contributing authors who provide at times a small contribution around a paragraph or even a few words, references, and sometimes more detailed input as required. During the course of the process, we reviewed more than 34,000 scientific papers in detail. Those were covered and reviewed and referenced within the report. And through the review cycle, 3 or 4 stages of review, we've received over 62,000 comments. Each one of those needs to be addressed, either accepting, rejecting, and providing rationale for either. So the reports, when they come out, are the most authoritative statement on probably any scientific discipline in the world. In terms of my background, and I put here in red, there was one from the private sector. I was the only author contributing, coordinating lead author or lead author from the private sector. And that's a recognised gap within the process. There are barriers in place that prevent more getting involved, but it's one that, in general, the IPCC are keen to address. But there are challenges there in place. And I would strongly encourage anyone who's in the position to be able to be an author on this to try and become one, because it is a very enlightening, rewarding, at times difficult experience, even more challenging because of COVID, and it's put a lot of stress and pressure on many of the scientists involved. Within the context of the Working Group 2 report, though, one of the big gaps at the start, which was identified at the first lead authors meeting in Durban all those years ago now, was throughout the report outline that was provided to the scientists, finance, the issue of climate finance was not included in any of the chapter outlines. So there was a big gap there from the start. I think this is summed up really even to this point now, where climate finance is a definition in the IPCC glossary. And I'll just read the first sentence out. There is no agreed definition of climate finance. So we're at a very low starting point, really, within the adaptation and resilience context, within the Working Group 2 context. Working Group 3, which is about to report, I think, a week on Saturday, they have a whole chapter on climate finance, but it was very much overlooked within the Working Group 2 structure. The role of finance is important because the crux of it is that we have to understand that we are facing a whole series of climate risks. And the IPCC framework is really about these component parts: the climate hazard, the vulnerability, and the exposure. And the role of this report was drawing upon this framework and brought together more information on the human society, linking in with ecosystems and biodiversity, and trying to make those interconnections that occur. But climate risk is the essence here. Once we understand that, we can start to address it with a lot more certainty. We're still based upon a huge amount of uncertainty because we're not fully sure about the precise nature of the climate hazard, how that will change and evolve over time, and likewise for the vulnerability and exposure. But climate risk is dynamic over time. It's often seen and portrayed as static. The transient nature of risk isn't really addressed, and this is a whole session for another webinar and other sessions. But we know the hazard over the future, the hazard will increase. The amount the hazard will increase will depend upon the underlying rate of climate change. And the only hazards that probably won't increase that much in an adverse way are cold-related ones. The exposure and vulnerability components will change, and they may change because of interventions. Improving the health of a population will reduce vulnerability. Understanding and looking at where people are and where ecosystems are and the threats they face may reduce exposure, but they could likewise increase over time. So we have to address risk as the underlying issue when we're starting to look at climate finance. And as it's mentioned in the report a great deal, every small increase in warming will result in increased risks. So whatever increase in temperature, not looking at 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 degrees Celsius, but every 0.1 degree increase in global temperature will increase risks somewhere around the world. And this is an image here of coral bleaching, and we've just seen major coral bleaching events now occurring on the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. So around the world, risks are changing, they're increasing as the hazard generally increases. And maybe, and we'll have to see, and that depends upon the system, the location, but the hazard is increasing at a more rapid rate than we're actually starting to adapt or build resilience to. So just some of the headline statements from the report. Biodiversity loss is going to occur at different warming levels. So the key ones we look at, of course, are the 1.5 degree rise in global temperature, which is a lot in tune with the Paris Agreement and the concern of the small island states, and then looking at a higher scenario, 3 degrees of global warming. And we're seeing here that for some parts of the world, even under a 1.5 degrees increase in temperature, and this is the terrestrial, not the marine side, we're going to see almost entire biodiversity loss. And as we ramp up temperature, that will increase around the globe. So, areas where we're looking at 50% or more biodiversity loss are common. And when we get to the very high levels of near extinction or complete extinction, we'll see that in alarming areas around the world, central of Australia, southern Africa, the northern latitudes in Russia. So we're seeing these risks, we're seeing these changes that are occurring. And at some stage, we need to look at how we can make these systems more resilient and build adaptation, because we're committed to long-term warming. Even if we stop all emissions now, we are likely to see temperatures increasing, sea levels increasing for many millennia. So we're committed already to long-term climate change. The report tried to identify the key global risks. So around heat stress, water scarcity, food security, and flood risk. With heat stress, we have exposure to heat waves, and they will continue to increase with warming. Water scarcity, at 2 degrees, regions relying on snow melt could experience at least 20% decline in water availability for agriculture. And it's not just agriculture, it's also economic development. It may be hydropower as well. So those glacial fed regions, if you look at South America, the surrounding areas of the Himalayas are looking at major issues around water security in the future. Food security, irrespective of whatever geopolitical conditions are happening, will increasingly be undermined. We're seeing large areas of the world that will become increasingly unsuitable, both as a result of climate change, but also other human impacts as well. And flood risk, about 1 billion people live in low-lying cities and small island states, and they will increasingly be impacted by rising sea levels. And again, looking at long-term thermal inertia of the oceans, that will occur for many millennia to come. We can't turn off that rise in sea level now. And we're picking up issues around the changes in the dynamics of the major ice and the major glaciers around the world, especially in Antarctica and Greenland. So in summary, one of the key points of the report was that there is an increasing gap between adaptation action that's taken and what's needed. The gaps are largest among low-income populations, and the report outlines that these gaps are likely to grow. So irrespective of money or finance, we're seeing this gap in adaptation. We are not delivering and deploying enough measures to prevent the impacts of climate change at a pace that is keeping pace with the changes and the rates of changes we're seeing in the climate system. And whether it's in a developed country or developing country, it's those lower income populations that will suffer the most. There are limits as well to adaptation. We can only do so much. Even with effective adaptation, we cannot prevent all losses and damages. And within the report as well, there's a key cross-chapter box on loss and damage. Keep that separate from climate finance for now, because that's looking at apportioning responsibility and attribution of losses. The report identified, and it's building upon the report of the series of IPCC special reports that came out in around 2018, 2019, that above 1.5 degrees rise in global mean temperature, a reminder that we're already at over 1 degrees above the pre-industrial, natural solutions may no longer work. And above 1.5, lack of fresh water could mean severe impacts on small island states, and as I mentioned already, those feeding off snow belts and glaciers. And above 2 degrees, and this is picked up on the land report as well, the IPCC special report on climate change and land, there will be challenges to farm multiple stable crops in many current growing areas. So huge impacts and huge challenges for many areas around the world, and these are especially relevant for those on lower incomes and the poorer livelihoods. We also have to deal with maladaptation. So across the world, we have seen actions put in place, attempted solutions put in place to adapt and protect and build resilience to climate impacts and other environmental impacts. Some of these haven't worked, and they failed in quite spectacular cases. Obvious ones are coastal defences, where we've seen the wrong type of coastal defences put up, which cause adverse impacts directly on those locations with beach scour or the ones that have been in place for many decades, groins which have prevented longshore drift and removed protection from coastal areas as well. And again, the evidence from the report said that those disadvantaged groups are most likely to be affected by maladaptation. So the wrong types of infrastructure in place, maybe to protect certain things, maybe we'll put those in informal assessments at more risk from climate change. We need to accelerate adaptation to meet this gap. That requires political commitment. It needs institutional frameworks in place. We need better knowledge. We don't have that complete knowledge yet of the impacts, risks, consequences, and what can be done to improve responses. Monitoring and evaluation of adaptation measures are essential to track progress. So to make sure that adaptation measures are keeping pace with the change we're seeing in the climate and environmental issues, but also that any maladaptation issues, any negative impacts of that adaptation and resilience can be addressed more rapidly. And across the report, we looked at inclusivity and equity, and it's identified that inclusive governance that allows wider cross-section of opinion will help improve justice and the success of adaptation measures. One of the key bits of work across the report was the identification of risks, and this builds upon the third assessment report of the IPCC in 2001, and it's been a core feature of the report since, is to identify the reasons for concern, what we nickname as the burning embers diagrams. In the working groups, in the AR3 in 2001, there was one simple diagram that encapsulated this, but there's a lot more work, a lot more evidence now in place to identify risks across different sectors and different geographies. And I won't go into these two slides now in detail, but I really strongly encourage you to look out, check out the summary for policymakers, and also delve into the relevant chapters of the report to see where these risks have come from. And chapter 16 really identified and put together these burning embers diagrams. But we know in detail, we know where the guardrail is, the 1.5 to 2 degrees guardrail. We already know that unique and threatened ecosystems will be at risk even now with the slightest increase in temperature. We used to define this as dangerous anthropogenic climate change. Many of my fellow scientists already say we're in that region of dangerous anthropogenic climate change, even with the changes in climate we're seeing now is leading to extinction, is leading to destruction of livelihoods and lives, and that is dangerous for those communities affected. We're even seeing now that if you look at large scale singular events, major changes in the ice shelves, in the ocean circulation, we're seeing that we're now touching upon the bottom limits of that as well. So across the report, they went into detail across freshwater systems, ocean systems, health outcomes as well, and looked at different scenarios. So there's a lot of wealth of evidence now around specific sectors within the report, and also the different geographies as well. So we were able to look at more detail at not just the global level, but going down into the key regions of the world as well, and even down into a country level. But within the context of the IPCC, it's very sometimes very difficult to get specific mention of adverse impacts of a certain country into the report because of political issues around that. So again, a vast wealth of information, and these figures are sitting on top of the tens of thousands of research papers that were reviewed by the process, within the process. So if we come to the money, I spent the last 2 years working at the Green Investment Group at Macquarie, which sat on top of $720 billion worth of assets. This figure of $100 billion per year for climate finance is mentioned a great deal. It's actually set into almost the international agreements now, based from Paris Agreement into the discussions that go on. Can we actually deploy $100 billion per year of finance into adaptation and sometimes mitigation? And there's arguments about whether you're including just mitigation or adaptation finance or both, but it's $100 billion. I'm actually very skeptical of this number. I undertook some research about a decade ago, and it comes out from one or two, or maybe just one particular integrated assessment study that was carried out about 2008, 2009 time. And it's been put in the literature and it's stuck. And 100 billion is a nice figure. It's a big, big number. And it's a nice round number as well. We can't be precise because the uncertainty is that it's going to be 100 billion or if it's going to be 150 or 76 billion. It's a nice round number that's used and garners attention as well. But it's stuck and people are trying to achieve and look at this target. But the problem here is if this is too low, it's not going to be sufficient just to reach 100 billion. And my view is that 100 billion a year is not enough to meet the needs of the globe in terms of adaptation and resilience. So just in terms of numbers, 100 billion, what can it buy? Well, you can buy, for 50 billion, you can buy the Palace of Versailles in Paris. Or for less than 100 billion, you can buy the Royal Navy. The GDP of Cuba is 100 billion, and 100 billion per year is laundered through the City of London in terms of dirty money. So again, it's a very big number. It sounds good, it's nice and round, and it's stuck within the negotiations and as a target to be delivered. At the moment, we're nowhere near that. And in terms of what the report has said, the adaptation gap, we're not delivering enough adaptation for the money that's being spent now. So in terms of what's being spent now, what does that mean? For specific areas of the world, again, work from a couple of years ago, seawalls protect the US against rising oceans could cost up to 416 billion a year by 2040. So in the next 20 years, you're looking at an expenditure of 20 billion a year just to the US. Florida, 76 billion just to protect Florida. Now, there's a challenge here as well that you're protecting existing infrastructure ecosystems, agricultural systems, and especially on the infrastructure side, it may, there's a financial issue there to protect high value real estate. So you will spend the money. Maybe less of a case in areas where the land or the perceived value is less. So there's a tendency then for a skew and bias towards developing countries or high value infrastructure. And you can see this at a local level as well, in cities like Lagos in Nigeria, where new expensive real estate is being afforded sea defense protection or coastal protection from sea level rise, whereas a large numbers of people living in informal assessment are given no protection. So you're already seeing a balance in the skew of adaptation and resilience finance towards areas where there's high value. Oh, sorry. So in terms of the actual operational deployment of adaptation and resilience, there's a stage. The earlier you do it, and the earlier you understand that you need to build resilience to climate change through adaptation or resilience measures, talk about the difference offline, etc., it's cheaper. So if you can understand that if you're building new infrastructure, if you do the climate change risk assessment at the start of the process, it will be cheaper and more cost effective than to try and implement measures after something is fully designed or something's been built. And we can see that within the real world, where existing infrastructure is more difficult to retrofit, more expensive to retrofit than building in adaptation and resilience into new infrastructure or new systems. So the earlier you start the process, the better, the more cost effective it will be. Within the report, and this is the this is the figure 1 from the cross chapter box on finance. So as I mentioned before, climate finance was not mentioned within the scoping of the report. So at the start of the process, I raised this issue, and we got included in the report something called the cross chapter box, which is in this case 4 pages. We were lucky to get 4 pages. Normally we get 2. So that's a total of 3,900 words. So across the whole report of 18 chapters, there was 4 dedicated pages to climate finance, which was put in, and I'll be, from my perspective, a bit of an afterthought. But one of the things that we looked at is actually what is being spent on climate finance. And this is where the uncertainties and the questions lie. So what we did was try to ascertain from the literature, which is very sparse. There's still not a great deal of comprehensive literature on climate finance for adaptation and resilience. And we see these ranges, depending upon the decade, that we're looking at between the current estimates are, I think, 17 billion up to just short of $1,000 billion are likely to be spent. And this just illustrates the huge uncertainty in what is needed, what's being spent, and how you actually understand and attribute what is being spent today. So we've got a very limited understanding of the amount of capital, the amount of finance that are being spent across the world on climate, for adaptation and resilience. Now, this is figure 2 from the cross-chapter box. It's actually really based upon data from the from CPI, the Climate Policy Initiative, which has been trying to look at and track finance flows now for a number of years. We know that most of the money that's attributed to climate finance goes into mitigation, the vast majority. And there's a simple reason there. It's more discernible to pick up what's being spent on mitigation solutions. And also there was a bigger push for mitigation going back to the 2000s and early 2010s as well. So the CPI have tried to look at the flows. From here, we can see that half is labelled in terms of the adaptation resilience field. Half it is purely adaptation, half is multiple objectives where you've got adaptation mitigation combined. So we're seeing this ability to track flows, but the money here that's being looked at is predominantly from the public sector. So the multilateral development banks, bilateral funding, very little of what's captured in here is from private sources, and private being business, and private equity sources and private finance. So we can see where the money's ending up. Majority is going into, the largest proportion is in sub-Saharan Africa, but a lot is trans-regional work on adaptation as well. And we can see that infrastructure, energy and other built environment takes up a fairly big share. And then again, from there, it splits down and gets very difficult to track. But the CPI have been doing this now for a number of years and provides that baseline. We realise, and again from the report, the headlines are, current global financial flows are insufficient. Most finance targets emission reductions rather than adaptation. And again, pointing out in the evidence that finance wasn't really addressed within Working Group 2 report from the outset. And there's a whole chapter in Working Group 3 on finance. And we know, and the evidence says, that climate impact can slow economic growth. And that evidence is now fairly robust. So the private sector. So it's widely acknowledged that to meet the targets, however meaningful or not meaningful they are, the 100 billion target, the private sector has to step up. And we know there's obvious benefits of resilience and adaptation. Avoided losses, top one, loss of protecting lives and livelihoods. You're increasing economic development potential around land value, risk rating reduction, and credit access. So and this is one of the perverse natures of nature of some of the work that is done. If you identify something is at risk, or a country has higher climate risk than a neighbouring country, the cost of finance will be more for that country that's identified as high climate risk. But there's also an obligation to identify areas that are at risk. So you have this vicious cycle of risk, identifying risk, increasing the cost of finance, therefore preventing deployment of adaptation and other climate solutions as well. And we know there's co-benefits as well. But for a private sector organisation, the key one here is economic potential. Can you increase the value of your own assets by deploying resilience and adaptation? And there's lots of studies in place that look at the cost benefit. And I've deliberately put just question marks here because, again, it's uncertain. The values go from negative. If you put in maladaptation, you'll have negative cost benefit. But some of the figures go up to $50. And it settles around, depending on what report you look at or what analysis has been done. Maybe for every $1 spent on resilience and adaptation, you get a $4 to $12 benefit. Again, sometimes very difficult to quantify and almost impossible to quantify. From the private sector side as well, and this goes into not just the finance sector, demonstrated here by the City of London, but also any major private business. It's difficult to identify what is being spent on resilience, and it's not disclosed through the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate Financial Disclosures, or whatever it stands for now. It's difficult to. They're wanting companies to disclose risk, but not what they're spending capital expenditure or operation expenditure on. So it's almost impossible to identify the full value or any value associated with climate resilience that's being deployed by the private sector. It's even more difficult to trace that as well. And the prime reason that there's a limited amount of money being spent on adaptation and resilience, other than in terms of maybe supply chain protection within a large global corporation, is that there's no identifiable return on investment for a private sector business, whether it's a bank or something else, to invest in what might be seen as public services, unless you're using schemes like public finance, public-private finance partnerships. So this is the key issue here. How can you identify a return on investment for an investment bank or any other organization that is wants to deliver adaptation? There are bonds in place, but these are mainly set up by individual private donors, done in a philanthropic way rather than in a pure business and financial return way. And finally, as mentioned, the full cost of delivering adaptation and resilience is not quantifiable. I don't think it can be fully quantified because of the disclosure issues. The annual value that is identified within the context of the UNFCCC is difficult to argue with, but it's also also encapsulates a huge range of uncertainty. And my view is more studies need to be done to really identify what that global amount should be and what should be really being put in these global targets. And the key headline statements on finance from the whole of the report are these two here: the recognition of the critical role of financing for adaptation and resilience as an important enabler for climate risk management is strengthened. So at least we know now that putting money in will help climate risk management, which seemed an obvious thing, but it's only through this report that has come out into the literature. But the gap, since the AR5, the gap between the estimated cost of adaptation and the documented tracked finance allocated to adaptation has widened. So we have increasing confidence about this as well, but still limited in terms of the literature available. And private sector finance for adaptation has been increasingly promoted as a response. And yet it's a solution, because the public sector, especially from the developed economies going into developing economies, can't provide the resources, the financial resources required. However, it's still difficult to say what the private sector has done, in terms of delivering adaptation and resilience options in developing countries. So we have this big gap. We have these big numbers in place. We have a limited but increasing amount of scientific evidence to help support this. But overall, the role to deliver the adaptation and resilience around the world, especially in those vulnerable and developing countries where you've got systems and communities at risk, it's very difficult to see how the amount of finance required is going to be made available because of the different problems in place and the different barriers that exist. Okay, so that's a very quick overview of what was in the report and what was not in the report. So I think there's still a lot that was in the report due to the limited evidence available. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David, for that really interesting overview and quite sobering overview of the Working Group 2 report, and highlighting the key questions that come out of it. I'm sure that's a lot of food for thought for the attendees. So we now have some time for questions. So if you have any questions for David, please put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. But to kick us off, I can see there's already one in the chat. Can anyone become involved with contributing to IPCC reports? And can you outline how professionals can contribute?
Yeah, in terms of the contribution, there are certain criteria that are required. And this is, from an academic perspective, it's relatively straightforward. You need to have some academic track record. You need to be nominated by a country as well. You can't just directly put your hand up and say, can I participate? That goes through the country representatives, and every country has a focal point which collates the potential authors for inclusion. In terms of how professionals can contribute, I've been fortunate. When I was at Mott MacDonald, and I'll call these companies out because they funded my time and my role in the IPCC. Mott MacDonald provided my time and paid for my time, which was as a lead author for, let's say, on the land report, was about 10-15%, and there's a CLA maybe up to 25% of my time. And the same for the Green Investment Group at Macquarie as well. They were happy to contribute to they were happy to fund my time, because there is a reward back. You get an awful lot of information back out of the report, and they see that as well as a good thing to put down on their engagement and profile. The other way is less intensive, is as a contributing author. But again, that may only take, it could take less as a day. There's a gap notice, and you can fill that gap within the chapter outlined. You know, and you know the authors, and you can get involved in the network. That's quite straightforward, and gets your in a way foot in the door for maybe future inclusion. The other way, especially for early career professionals, is as chapter scientists. We on chapter 17, that I was CLA on, we had about 4 or 5 chapter scientists contributing different amount of levels, but they were early career professionals who then had the opportunity to work out how the process worked. And you know, the two or three on my chapter ended up as contributing authors, and in some cases we could have made the case that they should have been lead authors because the amount of effort they put into developing it. But they often get the chapter scientists are often used as a they're the organisers. they help point the authors in the right direction and help coordinate activity across, and have a very important role. And I think they're recognised properly, but they hopefully are recognised, and their role is fully attributed. And then from that, they can help get their academic publication records and track records up as well.
Great, thank you. That's good to hear. Another question from an attendee is, can you expand on the point you made about inclusivity? Is this to do with participation or consultation with the general public, or more with specific vulnerable populations such as women or disabled people or those from socioeconomic?
It's both. Yeah. Again, the more, and it's borne out in the evidence, the more you put, the more ideas, the more different views you get into trying to tackle a solution, the better. The more diverse those views, the better. Now, often, especially for many marginalised communities around the world, we know that this is best done, that getting the views of those communities is essential into delivering the right sort of adaptation. They have local knowledge as well. It's all very well and good for a distant government to come and get involved, or a large funding organisation. But if they come in place and put in, trying to impose solutions that don't understand the needs of the community, from a gender perspective or other marginalised parts of society, you're not going to get the right approach, the right solutions. And there's evidence within the report to support that. And that's something that was really, I think, in most of the chapters, the equity issues and the inclusivity issues were, right therefore most of the chapters have a good discussion and section on that.
Great, thank you. And what is being done, or what discussions are being held on how private finance could be attracted to public projects, like level rise protection, for example, where the adaptive measure doesn't generate a revenue stream?
Yeah, no, I think this is at the crux of this. Thanks, Mark, for that. It's, you're going to get, if you can demonstrate a return on investment, this will happen. So the key way now this is being delivered is through public-private partnerships, or the private finance initiative, as it was called in the UK at one stage, but that got quite a bit of bad press in the UK context. But here, private capital, private finance is being used to support government, large-scale government projects. So one that springs to mind is a new coastal defence programme in the Netherlands. That's a very large-scale, multi-billion euro project, but that's supported by the private finance. And the way there is that the government will pay, the returns on the investment made, so they're paying interest rates. So that sort of type of concessional finance mechanisms are used. It's been, certain, I say the UK has a bad track record on PFI. There's a bad perception of it as well because of some of the projects that, not climate projects, but other projects that have been funded through public-private partnerships. So this is the crux of it. If you can't generate return on investment, the large-scale flows of private finance won't fall into these adaptation schemes. And also especially in a developed country context. So in the UK, companies, individuals pay tax. It's seen like that general taxation should be used for protecting the population or the economic value of the country as well. So they're generally seen that this should be a government thing in some countries, especially where the taxation streams are relatively high. But that again isn't always the case because there's pressures on government finances around, within the UK and around the world as well.
And do you think there will be mandatory assurance requirements on climate finance and climate resilience?
What do you mean by, sorry, can I just ask for clarification on assurance?
Assurance.
Komal?
Just wait for
Can
them
mean
to.
different things in different contexts.
Whilst we're waiting, I just had a quick question actually about, you mentioned the transient nature of risk, and there's been conversations as well about cascading risk vulnerabilities and the importance of taking these into account. How do you think we can kind of increase people's knowledge of risk in these areas and kind of bring it more into the climate conversation?
Yeah, that's a good point on the cascade. There's a big chunk on that in the report. I didn't cover it here, but that cascading risk is fairly well known. It's challenging because of, as you go through that cascade, the uncertainty is increasing. You need a more detailed knowledge. So, it's really increasing awareness, and we know. And unfortunately, one of the best ways to increase awareness is through exposure to the hazard. Now, that's not a good outcome because you don't want that's often one of the worst case outcomes. So, having that increased knowledge, I see this, the TCFD and also through the Task Force on Nature disclosures as well, are helping the private sector become aware of that and having them disclose their risk, which first of all means they've got to understand that risk and know where it is, helps them respond. Because once you've identified the risk, you generally have to act upon it because it's a duty of care to your stakeholders to do that. So that disclosure on risk is for encouraging through voluntary measures or forcing through legislation should help identify that those risks and bring that awareness around, and then you react to it and hopefully build the resilience to those risks.
Great, and they've and the other
okay, sorry, I've just got the thing from Komal now. This is increasingly becoming to be the case. So most, if you look on from an investment side, I did this when I was at the Green Investment Group. We looked at our investments, and we had third-party assurance, and we had our own internal assurance processes as well, which I'm fairly confident is still the best there were, to ensure that what we're investing in didn't leave us liable to loss of investment, loss of return, or where still there's other forms of liability that can be borne as well. So that external audit is happening in terms of when investments are being made, but as I mentioned through the TCFD and that, most big businesses now are having to assess climate risks. So it's not being done comprehensively at the moment, mainly because of lack of tools available, especially across big businesses that have multiple, many disparate assets. But that's becoming increasingly commonplace, and shareholders of companies are asking for this as well. So there's an increase, and one of the challenges here, and this is where, as an environmental science community, there's a lack of capacity still. There's not enough qualified individuals to really support the global community on understanding climate risk and then passing that risk on in terms of what can be done in terms of resilience and adaptation.
Great, and we'll just sneak one more question in if you don't mind, which is, do you see blue carbon resilience credits, which promote CO2 sequestration through blue carbon as well as through greater resilience, for example, enhanced coastal protection, as a scalable solution that can be attractive to both public and private sectors?
Yeah, no, I think it's very pertinent. I think it goes not just for blue carbon, but for terrestrial carbon sink as well, especially when you start looking at the multiple benefits. So if you can identify, let's just say blue carbon through seagrass, mangroves, if you can see that as a sustainable way of sequestering carbon, there will be benefits here because that carbon will have a value. And that will especially become the case as the price of carbon becomes more solidified. It's not just seen as an ephemeral sort of value, it's a real monetary value. And also the co-benefits of many the blue carbon scheme and the terrestrial based carbon sinks, if they're done correctly, in biodiversity, coastal protection, etc., have a good thing. What the challenge is where to put this stuff, what will happen in the future to this stuff. and trying then to monitor the long-term benefits. And you know, if you want to do this through a private sector thing, how to quantify in real monetary terms those benefits.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, David. Thank you for that really interesting presentation and talking us through some of the key findings of the report. And thank you to all the attendees for watching and engaging through questions as well.
Yeah, and I'd encourage you all to go and download at least a summary for policymakers, and that'll give you all the pointers to the relevant bits in the chapter. Each of the headlines has has references to the chapters and the sections in the chapters as well, to make it easier. Every word in the summary for policymakers had to be traceable to what was in the actual report, and then from the report into the references.
Amazing. Yeah, definitely take a look at that. I hope everyone found this beneficial and informative.